Okay, what we're doing right now is going through my attempt to expand Tony Bass 1966 rules out, and you'll see why we have to expand this. Just makes it easier. So troop types, there are regular and irregular troops. The irregulars are lumped in with peasants. Peasants are considered irregular, and so would maybe like your Dark Age Viking forces or something like that. That don't fight in a close or extended order formation of any type. So if you look at the movement rates, very similar to chainmail, light foot and light horse. So archers are lumped under light foot. That's why they're given the split fire and move. Light horse, same thing. They've got a rule for mounted bowmen that must dismount to fire and then remount. We'll see that in a few minutes. Different than Asiatic troops like the Mongols and the Tartars that could remain in the saddle and do that stuff. And I suppose samurai as well. So medium horse and heavy horse can't penetrate woods. That's an interesting distinction in these rules. Armored knights traveling at 6 and heavy foot traveling at 9. This is similar to chainmail. The movement rates for lights, however, are significantly better, which gets you into contact much faster. And then heavy, medium, and light horse, I think the progression is the same here, 12, 18, 24. I did not look at chainmail right before this. There was no turn sequence given, though the rules do specify missile fire is done before melee, just based on the order of things. So I've added this convention here. If you look at the missile fire, I expanded out the table and put in the ranges, just because as you travel across the as you travel across the battlefield, you're often making these measurements to determine where these shots are fired, because as you travel 1/3 of your distance, Mr. Light Footman, you lose one shot. So once you get to 5 inches, you lose a shot. Once you get to 10 inches of movement, you lose another shot. And then there's also an interaction between what type of bow weapon they're taking and the ranges at which those shots are taken, and ultimately the multiples and the saving throws. So fairly complicated stuff with missile fire. Split fire, like we said, mounted crossbowmen and mounted bowmen, which are longbows and short bows, although you couldn't really use a longbow on horseback. So I guess technically this would only be short bowmen would be able to do the split fire. Well, I guess if you're dismounting, you could have a longbow because you're not doing it from horseback. Okay, scratch what I said. Firing order. So you dice for firing order. There was one example that says if you're getting all 3 shots, you go first. I took that to also mean that if it's a 2-shot versus a 1-shot matchup, that the person with 2 shots takes his first shot, and then you dice for priority on the second shot. So I'm a little bit of interpretation on my part there. That is not in the rules. Determining hits, 2 ranks of figures can fire. Foot troops behind hard cover can't be fired upon. So you can lay down behind a wall. We're about to see that in the game we're playing here. Regular troops, like I said, dice differently than irregulars. Irregular troops dice individually, which at long range gives them a statistical advantage, I believe is how it would work out. Maybe even at medium range. Somebody out there check my math on this. But basically, you take the number of bowmen firing, divide it by 5. If the remainder is 3 or 4, you go ahead and toss a dice into the dice pool. You roll the dice in the dice pool, and then you come down here and you look at where the shot was fired from and apply a multiplier. And then I don't think the rules said round down, but that's obviously the intention. If you were rounding up, things would get wonky with the 3/4 right here. You might as well not do a 3/4 if you're going to round up for some of these shots. So I think the implication of the table is to round down. Saving throws. So these hits, so you roll the dice pool, you apply the multiple, that's the number of hits, but wait, there's more. people get to make saving throws. If they're in partial cover, they get to add +1. And then the table, this is where some of that really tight Tony Bath prose comes into play. When you expand out what he says, this is the table that it produces. It is amazingly brief in the text how you get to this table. I was shocked, but this is why I had to expand it out mostly, is this table right here. It's just maddeningly difficult to see what happens, and definitely much harder to play it at the table if you don't have this kind of table in front of you. I might simplify this further, but right now I think this is functionally good enough at the table for what's going to happen. And then lastly, if that pass-through fire causes the enemy to lose 1/3 of their troops en route, right? And it says any body of troops, so it could be footmen or mounted. They have to roll a 5 or 6 to continue the attack. It's kind of a discipline or morale check. Otherwise, they fall back in disorder. In disorder, there's 2 places in these rules where disorder is described without any mechanics for how to resolve disorder. So we'll talk about that later. And then lastly, melee. Almost all of these melee matchups, here's the attacker on the left. Here's the defender up top. Here's the number of dice that gets thrown. It's almost always, for these lower level matchups, 1 die per 5 men. The casualty multiplier, again, similar to the missile fire, there's a casualty multiplier. And then sometimes there's a saving throw and sometimes there's not. And then there are also additional notes that apply for certain matchups. So a lot of complexity, again, was collapsed into that text. Let's scroll down here. So things start to get a little bit strange once you get up here into the horse matchups. Definitely the horse matchups have some interesting lingo as well. And then you see this 1 die per man almost entirely disappears, and you go to what they call a straight throw. A straight throw. So armored foot versus heavy foot. If the heavy foot withstand a morale check, each armored foot fights 2 heavy foot in a straight throw. And victorious figures occupy the defender, right? The heavy foot is automatically killed. The other way around, right? So armored foot versus heavy foot, no saving throw for the heavy foot. However, the heavy foot versus armored foot, there's a special saving throw, which I've outlined down below. So again, I had to expand this stuff out to really kind of understand what your odds are of succeeding in an attack, and some of these additional instructions that would apply in certain matchups. And then lastly, there were just 2 places where Tony kind of missed the boat and did not give us the detail that we need to know if there's a saving throw or not. It refers to a rule that had no saving throw. I think maybe he was meaning to refer to a different rule in the order, or maybe he meant, hey, same as that rule, no save. So anyway, we'll talk about that if we get these particular matchups during the game. Also, there were terms used without definitions. So I took break to mean let's scroll down to break. So broken troops run 1d6 each for each of the figures, which was kind of odd. And I said basically the figure scattering like this leads to disorder. So this is the second instance where I think disorder is called for in the rules. Break and flee, no definition is given, so I'm treating that like a rout. And they move as described in mass at maximum movement rate, right? So I give it a definition. Charges home. This later we find out in Rule 19 that what charges home means that there is impetus. Light horse never gets impetus. Medium horse does. And then there's the second rule that finally explains how this works with medium horse. Heavy horse, it's very clear that they kill 1 enemy figure for every charging horseman. Medium horse, it's not clear until you get later in the rules. There are two medium horse matchups, and the second one describes that it actually functions the same way as a heavy horse impetus rule. Falls back a move, no definition given. I'm treating that as though it's a retreat, not a rout. And then Tony uses the term give way. I'm assuming that's a pushback situation. Straight throw we talked about. Here are the special saves. These are for dismounted and mounted knights only. So during a straight throw, usually you're having a matchup with knights, and the knights usually get a saving throw and their opponents usually do not. Interesting thing here, you get prisoners that can be taken, which could, if you're doing a campaign, could factor into ransom and things like that. Because later we'll see that no other prisoners are taken, right? If you're not a knight or a noble, forget it. You're getting slaughtered at the end of the battle. Weaker side, so no definition given. I'm just saying that's, you balance it out based on raw numbers. Stalled attack. So peasants, just like in chainmail, peasants and irregulars can't attack heavier troop types without making a roll to check their discipline. City militia, similar story. And then finally, light horse requires a 5 or 6 to charge home against armored foot. And again, they get no impetus, so I shouldn't say charged home. I should just say they can charge them. Medium horse charging armored foot also has to make this same kind of discipline test. Morale check. So you won't see a matchup matrix the way you do in chainmail, because in some cases there are automated break tests that there are automated breaks that occur, right? The matchup means that you're just automatically going to run away. If heavy horse charges city militia, those city militia automatically break. There are other circumstances where it says you've got to roll 1 dice. So in this case, you need a 4 or better, or you break. And then there are other instances, the English longbowmen, right? Infamously, and even the city militia down here again versus Lightfoot. This was missing from the matrix. I implied it from over here. Anything in yellow, I kind of implied. But there was a 5 here. So let's talk about the English longbowmen. They had to roll 5+. It didn't say they break. So what happens if you roll a 5+? I'm saying they fall back 3 inches in good order. They backpedal. As you see in WRG rules, versions 1 and 2, you can backpedal 3 inches. I'm going to say that's falling back in good order 3 inches. It's a backpedal. It's not. They backpedal, and you could, I suppose, follow if you've got the movement to do so. But anyway, that's how I chose to interpret a lack of having break in the text. Broken troops, we talked about that. Prisoners, armored foot and heavy horse are taken prisoner. Lesser ranks are always slaughtered according to rules. Disordered troops can be rallied by a leader. I'll give you more detail on that in a minute. Death of leaders and champions. So where your leaders and champions are on the battlefield in that block of troops, because there are rules about how heavy horse can penetrate into a block of troops, how ranks kind of fill in. So if you put your characters in a place where they can be slain, then a special morale check that affects pretty much the unit to which they're attached gets done. So if there's a lord, his feudal retainers, right, his household guard, his retinue, everybody that's near him, they've got a dice to see if they stand the combat. Champion, which again is not defined here, but I'm going to use the chainmail convention, right? This is probably a fighting man of 7th level, 4th level, 8th level, something like that. Then if the champion of the army, like if Achilles gets slain, then the morale of the lords and nobles in his vicinity must be tested. And again, no distance is given. WRG would specify 15 inches for this test. And I think there's a distance, maybe in chainmail, or I'm confusing my Army commander command radius rule. Anyway, I think probably 15 inches is safe for this. It should be within eye shot. They should be able to see that this notable champion has fallen or quickly hear about it. If they're on the other side of the hill and can't see that happened, then why would they be affected? And then finally, the fall of the king or the leader of a ward, battle, or army, or the capture of his standard. All subordinate groups and lords should be diced for. And the dice throw is interesting. Here you see from OD&D Little Brown Books that illustration that says "fight on" with the exclamation mark. Well, "fight on" is the text. I added the exclamation mark to be consistent with OD&D, but "fight on" is a term that you see in morale checks for other medieval rule sets from the early 1970s. Surrender here. So this is an interesting one. What happens if you surrender and you're light foot? You're going to get captured and you're going to be slaughtered, or if you're an archer. And I think that's consistent with some of what we saw in the period. Definitely the trope from Henry V that the prisoners were slaughtered because there were just too many to maintain order. Henry V was worried about losing control of the battlefield through the prisoners rising up and overpowering his men. So if you surrender and you're not a knight or a noble, then you're sealing your own death warrant. So this is a very bad dice result if you get that. Throw down arms and flee. Flee in my mind means leave the battlefield. You're removed from the battle at that point. Hold position but refuse to advance. Now you are defensive only. Maybe you move in retrograde only. Fighting withdrawal. It's interesting. So here is an interesting tidbit that you see in later BX rules and things like that. The ability to make a fighting withdrawal. Is that a retreat? Is that a backpedal? I think it's a backpedal. But again, not a lot of guidance. All right, let me stop this share and share something else. So in Don Featherstone's 1962 book, there's another set of rules from Tony Bath that actually does have rules for rallying. And again, this matches chainmail pretty closely. You've got 3 different turns during which there are attempts that can be made with progressively more difficult ability to make that roll. And if they fail enough times, they get removed. So I think adopting if we get in those circumstances, I'm going to look to his 1962 rules to adjudicate that. Interestingly enough, you see the same thing: the presence of a commander, presence of another noble can bump up the dice roll, and also if somebody joins the unit to help them out with their dice roll, they've got to remain with the unit for the remainder of the battle. So echoes of chainmail here from 1962, Don Featherstone and Tony Bath. And then finally, a write-in about the champions, about how to adjudicate that. We see this in History of Wargaming Project, Volume 4, put together by John Curry. And this is not technically a rule by one of the well-known authors. It's actually a cousin of Lionel Tarr. Lionel Tarr wrote these fantastic World War II rules that were widely used for a little while in the UK before more and more complexity got heaped upon it. And then, but basically, they use the term champions, and basically you assign a rank to your champion. There is a problem here in that the first person to throw scores a 6, they win the battle. So does that mean the first person to throw his dice on the ground? Is that meaning first person to come in base-to-base contact is actually the challenger? Not sure about that. But otherwise, the man with the higher score slays his opponent unless the difference between their scores fails to outweigh the points difference. So if I'm a hero and I assign the hero a value of 4, and then he goes up against a superhero value of 8, the difference between their two Their 2 net worth is about 4, right? So superhero 8th level minus hero 4th level, that's a difference of 4 levels. If I roll a 6 and if I am a hero and I roll a 6 and the superhero rolls a 1, then the difference between 6 and 1 is 5. 5 outweighs the difference between superhero and hero, and I would win the combat at that point. But if that superhero rolled a 2 and I rolled a 6, forget it. The superhero is merely wounded. So we'll see how this plays out, but at least it gives me a way to assign damage to the figures and figure out who won the battle. But it allows for a circumstance where one opponent may not slay the other outright. Yeah. So Lester Throw, he's wounded. He retires 1 move and remains stationary during the next. So similar to what we see with chainmail and the Fantastic Combat stuff. I found that to be interesting as well. And I think this was a rule that came in, I want to say this was also in the late 60s, early 70s before chainmail was promulgated. Okay, I've been talking way too long now. Goodbye.